wind, a relentless sculptor of the desolate plains, howled its ancient song, carrying with it the dust of forgotten dreams and the chilling whisper of a man's hollowed existence. He was a creature forged in solitude, a rancher named Silas, whose eyes held the same barrenness as the cracked earth beneath his worn boots. Life had stripped him bare, leaving behind a husk, a shell of the man he once was, burdened by a past that clung to him like the scent of old sorrow. His ranch, a testament to his own wilting spirit, stood isolated, a collection of tired wood and weary ambition, offering little comfort to a soul that no longer knew its own worth. He needed a wife, not for love, not for companionship, but for a convenience as stark and unforgiving as the landscape itself. An heir, a caretaker, a presence to fill the echoing silence of his home. The concept of a mail-order bride had felt like a practical solution, devoid of sentiment, a transaction designed to bypass the messy complications of human emotion. He had sought efficiency, a means to an end, a woman who would understand the unwritten contract of their union, a partnership of labor, a shared roof, and nothing more. He envisioned someone compliant, a shadow to his own, a silent agreement to their mutual indifference. Yet the woman who stepped from the dusty stagecoach, a figure of quiet dignity against the swirling grit, was anything but a shadow. Her skin, the rich hue of midnight, stood in stark contrast to the bleached landscape. Her eyes, deep pools of a wisdom he couldn't yet fathom, held a quiet fire, a resilience that hinted at trials far exceeding his own. This was not the pliable convenience he had ordered. This was a woman named Ilara, a force of nature cloaked in modesty, carrying her own unseen burdens, her own unspoken stories. Her arrival was not just the beginning of a marriage. It was the reluctant turning of a page in a story he believed had already ended. The silence that followed her first steps onto his desolate property was heavy, pregnant with the unspoken truths of their disparate worlds, a silence that both promised and threatened to unravel the tightly woven fabric of his carefully constructed emptiness. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. Ilara's gaze swept across the isolated ranch, taking in the skeletal trees and the unforgiving expanse of the plains, a stark canvas against which her own journey had been painted. Her decision to answer the advertisement of a distant rancher, a man known only through terse letters, had been born of desperation, a flight from circumstances that offered no solace, no future, no dignity. This was a bargain struck with fate, a gamble on a life unseen, a hope for a quiet existence devoid of the crushing weight of judgment and limitation that had long defined her path. She knew the terms of this arrangement, a marriage of convenience, a contract of necessity, a bond built on shared need rather than shared affection. His silence was a language she understood, a language spoken by men who had long carried the burdens of their own unspoken wounds. She saw the lines etched around Silas's eyes, the perpetual furrow in his brow, the way his shoulders slumped as if under an invisible weight. He was a man drowning, and she, a weary swimmer herself, was being offered a leaky boat. Their first exchange was a testament to the chasm between them, a dialogue of polite formality stretched taut over a bedrock of unspoken apprehension. He offered a curt welcome, his voice a gravelly whisper, stripped of warmth, devoid of any genuine invitation. She responded with a quiet affirmation, her voice clear, imbued with a strength that belied her weary frame. The air crackled with a tension born not just of their individual histories, but of the societal currents that flowed unseen between them, currents of expectation, of prejudice, of difference. She was black, he was white, and in the raw, untamed West, such distinctions carried an invisible weight, a silent conversation always simmering beneath the surface. He saw a woman, a vessel for his need. She saw a man, a shadow of his own torment. Neither saw the other fully, yet the bare bones of their humanity, stripped bare by circumstance, lay exposed. There was no pretense of romance, no illusion of tenderness, only the stark reality of their agreement, a promise whispered by the wind that swept through the desolate homestead. Two strangers, bound by a pragmatic pact, navigating a harsh world that offered no easy comforts. A past memory, sharp and sudden, flickered in Silas's mind. A barren field, a shattered fence, and the echoing silence after a storm, a precursor to the emptiness that now defined his days. The images were fleeting, yet their sting lingered, a silent testament to the pain he perpetually sought to bury. The days settled into a rhythm as relentless as the sun's arc across the vast sky, a routine defined by the unyielding demands of the land and the quiet, unsentimental cohabitation of two strangers. Hilara moved through the small ranch house with a quiet efficiency, her hands calloused but nimble, transforming the dusty, neglected spaces into something resembling a home, not through grand gestures, but through a meticulous attention to detail. A patch mended, a floor scrubbed, a simple meal prepared. Silas observed her, a silent sentinel, his gaze often lingering, not with curiosity or affection, but with an almost clinical assessment, a reluctant acknowledgement of her unforeseen competence. He had expected a wife, a laborer. He found a quiet force, an unseen anchor. His own routine remained unchanged, centered on the fields, the livestock, the endless battle against the encroaching wilderness. He spoke little, his dialogue terse, functional, stripped of any emotional resonance. When he did speak, it was usually a command, a query about work or a comment on the weather. Hilara responded in kind, her words economical, direct, yet always carrying an undercurrent of thoughtful resolve. There were moments, brief and fleeting, when the carefully constructed wall between them seemed to shimmer. Once a rogue calf strayed too far, lost in the gathering dusk, and Hilara, without a word, had simply walked out into the encroaching shadows, her figure a small silhouette against the vastness, to guide it back. Silas, watching from the porch, felt a strange prickle of something akin to surprise, a tiny crack in the stoic facade he so diligently maintained. Another time, she found him slumped over a broken fence post, his hands raw, a weariness beyond physical exhaustion etched into his features. She simply brought him a damp cloth, her touch brief, impersonal, yet carrying an unspoken recognition of his silent suffering. He flinched not from her touch, but from the sudden, unexpected vulnerability it exposed within him. He had built his world on isolation, on the belief that connection was a weakness, a gateway to pain. Her presence, quiet yet persistent, began to erode the edges of that hardened conviction. The house, once a tomb of his despair, now held the faint scent of baking bread, the rhythmic creak of floorboards, the low hum of a quiet, unfamiliar life. He resented it even as some deeper, forgotten part of him, a sliver of the soul he believed had long since withered, stirred. The emptiness he had cultivated was slowly, almost imperceptibly, being filled by something he had not asked for, something he did not understand, and something that, despite himself, he was beginning to dread and perhaps even faintly crave. The isolated nature of the ranch provided little shelter from the sharp eyes and sharper tongues of the nearby town. Word, like the relentless prairie wind, traveled fast, and the presence of a black mail-order bride on Silas's property became an instant focal point for whispers, for judgment, for the ingrained biases that festered beneath the veneer of frontier civility. Secondary figures, the town merchant with his patronizing smile, the gossiping women whose eyes followed Hilara with thinly veiled suspicion, the grizzled ranch hands who watched with a mixture of curiosity and thinly disguised contempt, all served as mirrors, reflecting the broader societal prejudices of the era. Their interactions with Hilara were fraught with an unspoken tension, a delicate dance around assumptions and expectations. Her quiet dignity often served as a challenge to their preconceived notions, her resilience a subtle affront to their casual bigotry. Silas, ever the solitary figure, remained largely detached from these overt displays of societal scrutiny. His own past, riddled with loss and bitterness, had cultivated in him a profound indifference to the opinions of others, a cynical aloofness that bordered on disdain. When the merchant made an offhand, racially charged comment in Hilara's presence, Silas merely grunted, his gaze fixed on the dusty street, offering neither defense nor condemnation. When the women of the church pointedly excluded Hilara from their weekly social, he made no move to intervene, seemingly oblivious to the sting of their deliberate slight. This moral ambiguity, this deep flaw in his character, was laid bare for Ilara to witness. He was not overtly cruel to her, but his failure to acknowledge or confront the injustices she faced, his silent complicity through inaction, created a new layer of tension between them. It was a silent question hanging in the air. How much of his own humanity had he sacrificed for the sake of his isolation? How deeply had the darkness of his past and the prejudices of his present corroded his capacity for empathy? Ilara, for her part, met these societal slights with a stoic silence, her face a carefully constructed mask of composure. Yet Silas, despite himself, began to notice the subtle tightening of her jaw, the way her eyes, usually so serene, would momentarily cloud with a quiet weariness. He saw the invisible weight she carried, a burden he, by virtue of his skin, had never truly known. A distant memory, sharp and cold, surfaced. A winter evening, a horse gone lame, and the bitter taste of helplessness. It was a fragment of the raw, aching wound that had driven him inward. But now, watching Ilara, a new dimension of quiet suffering began to unfold before him, a suffering that had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with the world they inhabited. The tension on the ranch, once solely a product of his own inner turmoil, now expanded to encompass the larger, more insidious forces of a prejudiced society, pressing down on their fragile, unspoken arrangement. The land, a relentless adversary, often brought its own tests, and it was during one particularly harsh late-spring storm that the fragile alliance between Silas and Ilara was truly put to the trial. A sudden, violent squall descended, tearing through the fences, scattering livestock, and threatening the very foundations of the ranch. Silas, driven by a desperate, almost feral urgency, worked tirelessly, his face grim, his body straining against the gale. He was a man possessed, battling not just the elements but the specter of past failures, of losses that still haunted his every waking moment. In the chaos, Ilara did not cower. Instead, she moved with an unexpected agility, her small frame surprisingly capable, securing loose shutters, helping to herd panicked animals, her quiet competence a steadying counterpoint to his frantic energy. There was no time for words, only the unspoken language of shared effort, of mutual survival. As the storm raged, a sudden blinding flash of lightning struck a venerable old oak near the barn, sending splinters of wood flying and igniting a smoldering fire. The threat was immediate, terrifying. Silas, his eyes wide with a primal fear, froze for a split second, a chilling echo of a past trauma momentarily paralyzing him. A memory, sharp and visceral, ripped through the carefully constructed barriers of his mind. The acrid smell of smoke, the roar of flames, the desperate, futile cries of a moment long since burned into his very soul. It was the fire, the other fire, the one that had consumed everything he held dear. He stumbled, a strangled sound escaping his throat, his body betraying the years of suppressed agony. But Ilara, sensing his sudden paralysis, did not hesitate. Without a word, she grabbed a shovel, ran towards the small watering trough, and began frantically splashing water onto the nascent flames, her movements swift and determined. Her immediate action jolted him back to the present, shattering the suffocating grip of his past. He joined her, his movements stiff at first, then gaining a desperate rhythm. Together, they battled the encroaching blaze, their hands raw, their faces streaked with soot, their breaths ragged. The fire, fed by the fierce winds, seemed almost sentient, a hungry beast threatening to devour their precarious existence. But with each bucket of water, each shovelful of dirt, they fought, not as husband and wife, but as two desperate souls bound by an immediate shared threat. In that brutal, primal struggle, the artificial distinctions between them, the carefully maintained distance, began to dissolve. He saw her not as a convenience, not as a mail-order bride, not as a woman defined by her race, but as a living, breathing testament to resilience, a flicker of unwavering light against the encroaching darkness. Her quiet strength, her raw determination, began to chip away at the fortress he had built around his heart. The embers of the fire, once a symbol of destruction, now glowed with a strange nascent warmth, hinting at a connection forged not in sentiment, but in the crucible of shared adversity. The aftermath of the storm, though calm, left a lingering residue of raw emotion on the ranch. The air, washed clean by the rain, felt thin, exposing the unspoken truths that had been stirred by the shared crucible of danger. Silas, his usual stoicism fractured, found himself increasingly haunted by the fragments of memory that the fire had violently dislodged. He was a man tethered to his past, and that past, a relentless phantom, began to coalesce from the shadows. Through subtle cues, a hand twitching, a gaze lost in the middle distance, a sudden sharp intake of breath at the scent of wood smoke, Ilara began to piece together the mosaic of his pain. She understood that his gruffness, his emotional distance, was not merely a personality trait, but a shield, painstakingly forged from profound grief. One evening, as the last light bled from the sky, painting the plains in hues of sorrowful purple, Silas sat on the porch, staring out at the scarred earth where the old oak once stood. The silence between them stretched, weighty and expectant. Then, without warning, the words began to trickle from him, haltingly at first, then with a reluctant, almost painful momentum. He spoke of the fire, not the recent one, but the one years ago, the one that had claimed his family. He spoke of his wife, a woman named Sarah, vibrant and full of laughter, and their young son Thomas, whose eyes had held the promise of an entire future. He recounted the horror of the day, his own desperate but futile attempts to save them, the guilt that had festered in his soul ever since, turning him inward, poisoning his capacity for joy, for connection. He described the rage that had followed, a destructive force that had consumed his desire for purpose, leaving him adrift in a sea of self-condemnation. He spoke of the land, once a source of pride, becoming a reminder of his failure, a desolate monument to his brokenness. Ilara listened, her presence a quiet anchor in the stormy sea of his confession. She offered no platitudes, no facile comforts. Her silence was a profound affirmation, a space for his grief to simply exist, unjudged. Her own eyes, pools of deep empathy, mirrored the silent struggles she had known, the burdens she had carried, though unspoken. She knew what it meant to lose, to be stripped bare by life, to navigate a world that seemed determined to break one's spirit. His words were sparse yet impactful, each one a stone laid bare from the heavy burden he had carried alone for so long. The air, once thick with his unspoken torment, now hummed with a fragile vulnerability, a nascent intimacy born not of romance, but of shared brokenness. The mystery of Silas, the source of his profound darkness, was unveiled, revealing not a monster, but a man profoundly wounded, a soul trapped in the amber of his own grief. Ilara's quiet presence, her unwavering gaze, became a silent invitation for him to finally step out of the shadows. The fragile revelation of Silas's past did not immediately mend the gaping wound in his soul, but it did create a new, almost imperceptible shift in the dynamic between him and Ilara. His words, once locked away, now occasionally surfaced in fractured sentences, raw and unpolished, yet filled with the weight of unspoken anguish. The ranch, once a place of stark functionality, now held the echoes of his past, a quiet chamber where the specters of his grief began to materialize. The societal pressures, though still present, felt less potent now, as a deeper, more personal conflict began to unfold within the confines of their shared home. The tension, once external, now became acutely internal, a battle fought within Silas's own fractured psyche, with Ilara as the unwitting, yet essential witness. He found himself observing her more closely, noticing the small details, the hum she sometimes made while tending to the garden, a melodic thread weaving through the silence, the way she meticulously cleaned his worn tools, a quiet act of care that transcended their pragmatic agreement, the unwavering strength in her gaze when she met his, an unspoken challenge to his self-pity. Each observation was a tiny hammer blow against the walls he had meticulously constructed around his heart. He would occasionally snap, a sudden flare of old anger, a lashing out born of frustration and the unfamiliar discomfort of vulnerability. He would revert to his terse, almost brutal efficiency, attempting to re-establish the emotional distance, to rebuild the fortress. But Ilara, with a quiet strength that bordered on stubbornness, would not allow it. She did not confront him with accusations or demands, but with a steadfast presence, an unwavering belief in a core humanity he himself had long abandoned. Her questions were not accusatory but deeply rhetorical, forcing him to confront the implications of his choices, his ongoing retreat. One evening, a particularly bitter argument erupted, not about chores or finances, but about a distant, abstract notion of hope. Silas, steeped in his cynicism, dismissed it as a fool's dream, a cruel illusion. Ilara, her voice low but resonant, spoke of resilience, of finding light in the deepest darkness, of the inherent dignity of simply enduring. Their words, sparse yet impactful, crackled with unexpressed emotion, each sentence laden with subtext. His anger was a mask for his profound fear of feeling again. Her quiet conviction was a challenge to his desperate clinging to despair. The true confrontation was not between them, but between Silas and the shattered pieces of his own identity. He saw in her not a rescuer, but a mirror, reflecting the stark reality of his brokenness and the terrifying possibility of healing. The tension reached a peak, not through a dramatic external event, but through the raw, emotional unraveling of a man who had long convinced himself he was beyond redemption. The air was thick with the weight of unexpressed tears, of unspoken longing, of the battle for a soul that had seemingly given itself over to the wilderness. The breaking point arrived not with a thunderclap, but with a soft, persistent rain that mirrored the slow, steady thaw within Silas. The argument about hope had left them both raw, exposed. Days passed in a strained silence, broken only by the necessary rhythms of ranch life. Silas, however, found himself unable to shake Ilara's words, her quiet conviction echoing in his mind, gnawing at the edges of his carefully cultivated despair. He began to see his ranch, not as a monument to his failure, but as a place capable of new beginnings, a space to sow not just crops, but forgotten dreams. The metaphors of the land, once instruments of his self-pity, now shifted, subtly, into symbols of resilience and rebirth. The parched earth that yearned for water, the seeds that pushed through the soil against all odds. These mirrored a burgeoning, terrifying hunger within him. One evening, as the rain drummed softly on the tin roof, a sound that usually amplified his loneliness, Silas found himself drawn to the small, flickering light emanating from the kitchen. Ilara was there, her head bowed over a mending basket, her hands moving with quiet purpose. He stood in the doorway, a silent, gaunt figure, the weight of years of unspoken grief pressing down on him. Then a shudder ran through him, a physical manifestation of the dam breaking. He began to speak, his voice hoarse, choked with emotion, confessing not just the facts of the fire, but the raw, visceral pain of his helplessness, his regret, the suffocating burden of his survivor's guilt. He spoke of the dark nights, the haunting dreams, the desperate attempts to outrun the memories, only to find them waiting for him at every turn. He confessed his moral failings, his deliberate retreat from humanity, his cynical belief that he deserved only isolation and sorrow. He spoke of his profound, aching emptiness, the hollowed-out space where his soul should have been. Ilara slowly set down her mending, her gaze fixed on him, unwavering, compassionate, yet deeply challenging. She did not interrupt, did not offer facile comfort. Instead, her presence was a crucible, a space where his agony could finally be poured out without fear of judgment. When his confession finally tapered off, leaving him breathless, tears streaming down his face, Ilara simply reached out, her hand gently closing over his calloused one. Her touch was not romantic but profoundly human, an anchor in his storm. Her voice, soft yet firm, finally broke the silence. She spoke of the enduring power of forgiveness not just for others but for oneself. She spoke of carrying scars, not as burdens, but as maps of survival. She did not absolve him, but she offered him the profound gift of witnessing, of being truly seen in his brokenness. In that moment, a profound shift occurred. The soul he had believed lost, withered away by grief and self-condemnation, began to stir, to breathe, not yet whole, but undeniably present. It was a baptism by fire, a surrender not to despair, but to the terrifying, liberating truth of his own wounded humanity. The air crackled not with tension, but with the fragile, shimmering possibility of redemption. The revelation, the confession, and Ilara's quiet, unwavering empathy had cracked open something vital within Silas. The raw wounds of his past were not instantly healed, but the suffocating pressure of unexpressed grief had been released, allowing a tentative, fragile breath to enter his soul. The air on the ranch, though still carrying the scent of dry earth, now held a hint of something fresh, a subtle shift in the very atmosphere. Silas moved differently, his shoulders slightly less slumped. His gaze, though still often distant, occasionally held a new, nascent curiosity. The convenient marriage, a contract once so devoid of emotion, began its slow, arduous transformation into something far more profound. It was not a sudden burst of affection, but a gradual, almost imperceptible softening, a recognition of shared humanity forged in the crucible of sorrow and survival. The townspeople, the secondary figures who had once embodied societal biases, noticed the change, though they struggled to articulate it. The merchant, accustomed to Silas's grim silence, found him occasionally offering a brief, almost polite nod. The gossiping women, their eyes still sharp, observed Ilara walking with a newfound confidence, her quiet dignity now imbued with a quiet triumph. Their prejudices, though deeply ingrained, seemed to falter in the face of a visible shift in the rancher's demeanor and the quiet, undeniable strength emanating from his wife. It was not a grand societal revolution, but a series of small, significant tremors. The world, in its vast indifference, had not changed, but Silas's perception of it and his place within it had irrevocably shifted. Their dialogue, while still sparse, gained new layers of meaning. A simple question about the day's work could now carry an unspoken thread of care. A shared glance across the dinner table could convey volumes of understanding. He found himself seeking her out, not for tasks but for her quiet presence, for the grounding wisdom in her eyes. He began to trust her, not just with his home, but with the fragile, re-emerging pieces of his soul. He spoke of plans for the ranch, not with the grim determination of a man battling fate, but with a tentative hope, a vision for a future he had previously believed impossible. Ilara, in turn, began to share more of her own quiet dreams, her voice, once carefully contained, now carrying a gentle resonance. The irony was palpable. A marriage entered purely for convenience had become the unexpected vessel for profound emotional growth, a quiet act of redemption. The ranch, once a bleak landscape of his despair, was slowly beginning to bloom with the tender shoots of renewed purpose, a testament to the quiet power of connection and the enduring strength of the human spirit. The past still lingered, a scar on the horizon but no longer a prison. The plains stretched endlessly, but now, to Silas, they no longer signified an empty expanse, but a canvas awaiting the brushstrokes of a future he had once disavowed. The harsh light of the sun, once a cruel reminder of his desolation, now illuminated the tender green shoots emerging from the soil, a metaphor for the fragile, tenacious hope that had taken root within him. His soul, once a parched landscape, had begun to drink, slowly, deeply, from the wellspring of human connection Ilara had so quietly offered. It was not a complete transformation, no sudden erasure of the man he had been, for scars, even healed ones, leave their indelible marks. But he was undeniably changed, a man reborn not through grand epiphany, but through the patient, unwavering grace of another. The gruffness remained, a familiar echo, but now it was tempered by a newfound gentleness, a nascent capacity for warmth that surfaced in unexpected moments, a brief, almost imperceptible smile, a lingering gaze of profound gratitude, a quiet act of consideration. Their life together continued, grounded in the realities of the land, the daily labor, the cyclical rhythms of nature. But the underlying current of their existence had shifted. The convenience had given way to a quiet, profound partnership built on respect, understanding, and a shared acknowledgement of their mutual, deeply flawed humanity. Ilara, who had sought only a refuge, found herself nurturing a soul, unknowingly becoming the catalyst for a man's return from the brink. Her strength had not been in dramatic pronouncements, but in her unwavering presence, her silent endurance, her capacity to see beyond the brokenness to the glimmer of light within. She had not just offered him a convenient marriage. She had, with quiet dignity and unwavering resolve, given him back his soul, piece by agonizing piece. The narrative culminated not in a grand, dramatic flourish, but in the quiet resolution of two lives, intertwined by circumstance, then deepened by a shared journey through darkness towards the fragile promise of light. The open loops of Silas's past, while perhaps never fully closed, now held the wisdom of hard-won lessons, his memories less a torment than a solemn reminder of resilience. The irony was profound. The man who had sought to avoid all emotion had found his humanity in the most unexpected of unions. The woman who had sought only escape had become an unwitting architect of redemption. Their story was a testament to the quiet power of human connection, the subtle yet profound impact one soul can have on another, even when wrapped in the guise of necessity. The final image was not of a broken man, but of a man standing taller, his gaze sweeping across the vast, challenging plains, not with despair, but with a quiet, enduring sense of purpose, his hand perhaps resting on Alara's, a silent promise whispered on the ever-present wind. Their quiet triumph was a profound testament to the unspoken miracles that unfold in the most unlikely of places.